Hi, everyone. Well, I'm not sure what happened. One of the things with live shows, we had a little bit of a glitch, it seemed, and we went live, and then it seemed to maybe we got bounced out. So here we are, starting now, and we're going to jump right into the conversation. I want to introduce my guest today. Um, One of the things that I do with my show, Curious Minds, is examine topics and interview people that have interesting backgrounds and stories to share. And I also talk about sign up, suit up, and show up, especially in the area of manufacturing and getting more people in manufacturing to both tell and share their story. So, the guest today is we're going to be talking about a topic that is of great interest to me because it's one that I struggle with in terms of really understanding things around climate change and what it means. And we hear a lot of different topics around that and discussions, and sometimes there's a lot of anger around it as well. And I'd really like to have a more broad-based discussion. So I'm going to bring Melissa back on screen. Hello, Melissa. And again, sorry about that. We had sometimes, as I said, when we do a live show, there's glitches along the way, but here we go. Let's dive in. And I know people will be watching this on replay as well. And it looks like right now we are indeed. Let me just double check here, make sure things are. And if anyone is watching, if they can. Let me just see here. That. Okay. Yep. It does show. It shows we're live now. So, okay. So let's maybe start with, as I said, this is a topic that, the oil and gas sector and looking at energy, that's a little bit newer to me because, even though I work in manufacturing, I was curious to get a bit bigger picture. So I've been doing some research, and we connected initially on Twitter. So can you maybe talk about that, about why you use Twitter and a bit of your background about that platform?
I really like Twitter because there's a lot of views on there. There isn't a bias with certain topics. It's just people expressing their feelings, people expressing their views. And really, this is where I do most of my learning because even if I don't agree with an opinion, it'll prompt me to go and research what they had just said. And a lot of people don't realize that, you know, a lot of things come up and are discussed that wouldn't normally be. And I really like the people with strong opinions because these are the ones that make me go and research different things. And that's where the learning comes in for me. And I'm like, well, yes, this was true, or no, it wasn't, or it was somewhere in between. And I think that's where and I think that's where, as a collective, we all learn, and that's where we we get to share ideas. Like, I really like the platform. It's been one of the ones that I've shared a lot of my thoughts and opinions on certain topics, and it's one where I can agree with a lot of the things, but it's also a platform where I can also disagree on a lot of things, and it's there's a lot of vitriol out there. I mean, there's a lot of people with, far either right or far left opinions, and you just gotta, sort through that as best as you can. But at the end of the day, it's, am I helping in some way? Am I helping this discussion in some way? And really, that's what's important to me.
Well, very true. And I think I will say this, you are helping because our paths crossed because of me seeing you on Twitter. And I also have a curious mind. So I want to lean in and listen to people I disagree with as well. In fact, I like that. Now, not the people who are angry and using, hate-filled language. That's like, no, that's not what I'm looking at. But people who have some strong opinions and put forth data, I want to go check that and see,
Yes.
interpreting data is another issue. Here's what's interesting. Before, as I was preparing for the show, I did a quick search. So I went into Google and looked up, oil and gas and climate change on Google. And then I did oil and gas and climate change on Twitter. Wow. I'll just say everybody should, when you're looking at controversial topics, go do a Google search first, because it's amazing what's not there. I will admit I had a lot more trust and faith in Google than I maybe do now, because um, the missing information was quite glaring.
Mhm.
And I think I think there's a lot of people that think when you're going to do some of these searches that you're getting a full picture, and we really aren't. And that to me, that's one of those red flags. I go, huh, why is that? See, now I want to know, why aren't some of those insights and information? And you are a large user on Twitter, so I would expect that you should come up fairly high on a Google search, but no, not so much. um,
And
yeah,
that's unfortunate because there is such a diversity of Indigenous voices out there, whether it's with the oil and gas industry, whether it's in politics. There's a diversity of voices, and a lot of the voices aren't being heard. And if we start working together and we start kind of putting these pieces together, we can get a lot farther, even just on something like climate change. Like, it doesn't have to be climate change right now is being portrayed as this all or nothing. Like, we either use oil and gas or we don't. If we're going to reduce emissions in any industry, whether it's manufacturing or oil and gas, we have to implement technology to reduce emissions if that's what our target is. And right now, it just looks like we're trying to axe an industry that you know helps Canada, helps Canadians, and we have to start thinking about ways to reduce emissions because that's the goal. So how are we going to get there? Through technology. And the technology that's happening right now is something that could be implemented in something like manufacturing, like your industry. We look at something like carbon capture, and my cat is not being.
yeah. See, this is the second time we've had a cat guest on my show. So there we go. It's fine. See, they know. I know they know. They know when something's going on, and cats especially say, like, "Excuse me, I want to be part of this." What's the
And
cat?
every time I try to put them down, they just sit down. Okay, so hopefully they behave. But one of the interesting technologies that are happening today is carbon capture and storage. And we need to start looking at ways to implement this into not just oil and gas, but manufacturing. We have, quite a big sector here in Canada. So if we truly want to reduce emissions, let's start looking at solutions. And the solution isn't axing an industry.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, because and you mentioned that all or nothing. It seems to be, when I first heard the term, not first heard, but when it came up on my radar, as discussing it and as a topic, it's almost like people would say, like, well, you're either you believe in climate change or you don't. And then if you don't, and that's takes us down a rabbit hole, right? And I think what are your thoughts on that, about that debate, whether there is, like, the term climate change, if you put that in air quotes?
I believe so. I come from an environmental perspective. I think we can do a lot more in terms of what we're putting out there, what we're putting out into the environment. We can definitely, we can be more efficient. We can create a cleaner environment. So I come from that angle, not necessarily climate change. I don't go down the road where it's like we have to do something by 2030 or we're going to perish. I don't buy into that, but I do think we need to do things for the environment, to help the environment, and to reduce emissions. And if that's our goal and our target, how are we going to get there? We need to start having adult conversations about this, and we need to start looking beyond the world is going to end in 2050. We don't need to be having those discussions. We need to be having discussions about emissions reductions, because this is what it's all about. And we not only have to look at Canada, but we have to look at the rest of the world, because if we reduce emissions, what impact is that going to have from other countries who emit higher pollution? What difference is that going to make? we don't have a boundary in the sky to say, okay, this is Canada's space and this is United States space. No, we all share the same world. We need to all be making the same decisions at the same time, and we need to be reducing emissions at the same time in order for this to work.
And that's really interesting too, because I did do a little bit of research and I've heard this, like we're in Canada have, things like the carbon tax, and maybe talk about that a bit more. And the impact, one of the things I find anytime there's a mandate or some of these decisions are made, and when there's taxes, it seems the most disadvantaged in our society are often hurt the most or impacted the most. Let me say impacted the most. Can you maybe talk to that about putting some context around the carbon tax? And then we'll look at the chart of what's happening in the world.
So I come from a poverty-stricken community. Like, we don't have a lot in terms of jobs. We don't have a lot to really take care of ourselves. People are living from paycheck to paycheck. There is not a security. We have a lot of food insecurity. We have, people are having a hard time paying their utility bills right now because of the carbon tax. And it's affecting poverty stricken communities disproportionately, because when a tax goes up, they feel that impact just as I do. And if they're already not making ends meet, well, they're going to be further down in poverty than what they started off with. So it's impacting our communities, it's impacting northern communities, it's impacting the price of food, and Indigenous people are the ones who are suffering from this. And to say that this tax is saving the environment, how? How is this money being spent? That's not always clear in their mandates. They can't tell us if it's going towards forest management. They can't tell us it's going, towards technology, it's research. Like, where is this money going and how is it helping our environment? Because what we're seeing right now is that people are suffering, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. They have these incentive payments going out every 3 months, but is that enough for people to recover? It's not. And it's getting a lot harder for seniors. It's impacting everybody across this country. And nobody's asking, well, where's this carbon tax money going? And how is it helping the environment? That's something I still have yet to see an answer to.
And it seems to be, as I'm watching a lot of the political debate, there seems, and we could have a whole show talking about that, about the political debate and what people are focusing on. But the carbon tax, there seems to be not a lot of discussion. It seems to be a lot of finger pointing and attacks about, even on, for example, there was photos about who had bowed their head in House of Commons for Indigenous Peoples Day. Like, it seems to be that's where people are focusing as opposed to problem solving.
Yeah. And especially on the day, where we're celebrating Indigenous people, for me, it's very, it's almost offensive to pull us into a political fight, especially on the day that's marked for Indigenous people. This is a day where people can go out to a celebration, where they can enjoy a powwow, where they can go out and meet the locals. It's a day where they can even do some learning, where they can look at the 94 calls to action, where they can look at, the calls to justice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There is so much that could be done on that day, and it should not be a day that's used as a political punching bag and to be, saying, well, this person doesn't really care about Indigenous people because they didn't bow their head. Well, that's not what this day is all about. This day is about learning. It's a day about getting to know your neighbor. It's a day to celebrate Indigenous Canadians. And that's often overshadowed by political rhetoric like that.
Yeah. And, this is where I just go, this is what's getting ridiculous, because there were other people on other sides of the house too that didn't bow their head. Like, it was this, and again, I have a real big issue with, I call it cherry picking, where there's like a show and someone will take one clip out of it, and someone could take a clip out of this show too, right? And that's why I always try to put it in context. And, you know, I call myself a recovering journalist, because one of the things I never try to do is to take a clip that isn't representative of how the interview went. And I often see people on opposite sides of stories like take a clip out of context to try to like do the gotcha, right? And and when I saw that about the headband, I was like, really? Like that's what you're gonna talk about? And there were some people like, hey, there's unnamed sources do stuff like that, but sometimes when I see people that should be taking a bit higher road and not getting into mudslinging like that, it seems kind of a waste of energy.
It is. It definitely is.
So let's look at, so we've talked about carbon tax, we've talked about what's happening, and being, you know, stepping back and taking that wider perspective on the issue of climate change. The same thing. Now we have a lot happening here in terms of EV, electric vehicles, batteries. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's also a very big topic, and there seems to be a push to say, let's go 100% EV vehicles.
That's going to be a tough sell in a Canadian winter. I grew up in Saskatchewan. I live in Edmonton. There are months where we experience minus 30, minus 40 weather, and these types of vehicles aren't very efficient in certain locations or certain areas. And I think that needs to be addressed. If you're not traveling as much and you're living in an urban center and maybe you only go 5 kilometers to work or 10 kilometers, maybe just for shopping, an EV makes sense in that regard because you're not having to travel long distances. And in my community, if we wanted to see a doctor, we would have to drive an hour and a half one way. Or if we wanted to go to a different city, we'd have to go 2.5 hours in another direction. So EVs in the winter don't make sense in some areas. And I think people need to get out of this narrative that we all have to transition over at the same time. Secondly, people can't afford an EV, and people don't have the infrastructure in their home to have an EV. You need to have a special outlet. You need to have a place to charge your car. You look at apartments. Is this possible for everyone? And to say this is our transition and this is our way to reduce emissions, once again, it's very one-sided. They haven't even looked at the electrical grid yet and upgrading that. What are they going to do 5 years from now when we have thousands more out there driving EVs? Is it going to be able to handle that? And every time it's asked, there is no answer. And if we're going to go towards EVs and 100% towards EVs, well, we need to address the issues that they pose in Canadian winters. First, we need to look at the reliability of them. We need to look at who can afford them, because once again, there's a disparity in who can, who can pay a carbon tax and who can afford an EV, because not everybody can. And we're still going to have gas-powered cars out there. And is that going to be okay? Or do we have to look at other technology? Another interesting thing with carbon capture is that some companies are looking at using it in cement and concrete, and using it in other industries, whether it's roads, whether it's, there's other alternatives out there to EVs. And the way we're looking at it right now is that that's the only solution. And it's not. If we start looking at the technology and what it can offer us, there's a lot out there that can be explored.
And what's interesting is that we can, I always say two things can be true. We can support the move to electric vehicles, but also question the quick pursuit of it and making it mandated to be 100%.
That's 100% true. There's always this, I'm going to call it a false dichotomy. There's always this thing where we have to choose, where we have to either go down this road of EVs, and if we don't, or we question it, then we're climate deniers.
Yeah.
And that is so frustrating. And it's the same thing with the oil and gas industry. If we support the industry, that means we're climate deniers. That it just doesn't make sense to me. We can be right in the middle and we could be coming up with solutions to climate change without us being labeled a climate denier. So we need to bring adult conversations back into this discussion, because if we don't, we're going to be, it's going to take us longer to reduce emissions, really. Like if we start shutting out voices, it's going to take us a lot longer to get to the net zero. And the solutions that are on the table right now, they're good solutions. I absolutely do not, I don't, I'm not against them, but I'm against saying that this is the replacement for something, because it's not.
That's very well put. And I often fall into that category of like, I believe this, but also this. And it's very frustrating that currently on many topics, it's not just this topic, there's so many topics that if you don't believe 100% in this view, then you're an anti whatever, or you're given a negative name. And I've seen it now. There's a pattern that's starting to develop where, there's a lot of name calling if you don't buy wholesale into everything that, and sadly right now that, some of the leaders and government leaders are saying. And I always say I come from a more nonpartisan perspective, and as a former journalist, I guess I really wonder why there isn't, like it used to be, especially when we had investigative journalists. If everybody was saying this, they'd be like, wait a minute, let me go look at the other side. Let me bring forward some other information. And the other thing is, I spent a fair amount of time, and I won't mention the name because I know there has been some, and because we're also on YouTube, and this is sad that I have to say this, but there is an unnamed, should we just say, if anybody wants to go, I listened to a 3-hour interview with someone who is running for, as a presidential candidate in the States, and had some really interesting, insightful information. But if we talked about that on now, my show would probably, I might get in trouble. So I'll just say, if anybody wants to message me privately, I would be happy to share a link of that show, because I invested 3 hours to listen while I was doing some other things. And sadly, not everybody does that. And I know you're someone who invests time to research. And that's why I want people like you on my show for that reason, right? That people that are not all one-sided.
Yes. And there's definitely different views when it comes to Indigenous people, because we don't all share the same ideas, the beliefs. Not all of us work in the oil and gas industry, so we're not going to share the same viewpoints. But what I've been seeing out there is a lot of, we're against oil and gas, we're against pipelines. And yes, some people out there may be, but that's not a representation of all of us. And which is why I started really going on Twitter and making my viewpoints known, because I wanted to break that narrative that we're against something, and to really show the diversity of our people and the diversity of the industries that we work in, because it's, we're different. We're not all the same. And, we have to kind of get out of that narrative that we're a monolith, because we're not.
Very, very true. So thank you for that. So let's look at, for anybody new tuning in, we've had a discussion about, your background, Indigenous woman working in oil and gas, and you're also a policy analyst. So let's address that and give a little bit of context of the work that you do, because you're not just, talking off the top of your head. You're employed by, and I'm going to put this up so people can, let me, sure I get it right. So with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, correct?
Yes.
Okay. let me start with this, and then we can give some. This is one of the things I found from the website. Our goal is to be an indispensable source of reasoned and timely thought leadership for policymakers, opinion leaders, and Canadians at large. So maybe with that insight, can you talk about what you do as a policy analyst there?
So, a lot of what I do is outreach to Indigenous communities and leaders in Canada who not only support the oil and gas industry, even to those who don't, because I believe it's important to get everybody's viewpoints out there, especially when you're drafting policy, making policy, especially when decisions are being made in terms of finance, partnerships. We need to have those different views. So for me, it's always it's the fun part of the work that I do, and it's the information gathering, and it's helping shape where the conversations are going. And I think that's a big part of what I do, not only just in the policy world, but also on Twitter, is to help shape those conversations, because maybe I'm saying something that somebody hasn't thought of, or maybe I'm bringing something forward that needs to be addressed. And a couple of times I've been a witness to various acts in the House of Commons. I've given my viewpoint, and I come from a finance background, so economic development is big, and living through poverty and seeing my community continue to be living in poverty, I'm really big on getting to solving this. Even if we do it one community at a time, we need to solve this. We need, as Canadians, we need to start looking at this as a bigger issue, because poverty, the issues that stem from poverty are, high incarceration rates for Indigenous people. Yeah, it's higher rates of children in care. These are all the effects of poverty, and we need to start looking at how we can solve this on reserves, because this is happening in our own country. And if you look at a community like mine that's 90% poverty, unemployment, we need to start addressing that sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we're going to keep seeing these issues. We need to start creating safer places. We need to start creating our our own sovereignty. If we're ever going to get there, we need to start addressing employment, and we need to start getting those numbers. And this is part of the work that I do, is collecting data and making sense of it and figuring out ways that we can do it. And one of the benefits of working in the oil and gas industry was, we were always near Indigenous communities. So now is our opportunity to really reach out to them. Even if they're not reaching out to us, it's our time to reach out to them and to see how we can help them and ask them what they want and what they need, and to go from there, because housing, water, these are all big ticket items in our communities that we need to start looking at.
It's interesting because I also do some work in the area of mental health. And one of the things there's a youth organization, and they look to hire people with lived experience. And it's interesting because you certainly seem to be a good example of someone with lived experience. So can you maybe just give a little highlight so you grew up in a reserve in Saskatchewan, correct?
Yeah, so my family is from the Muskowekwan First Nation. We're an hour and a half north of Regina, and we're 2.5 hours, I'm going to say southeast of Regina or Saskatoon. So we're kind of right in the middle, what I want to kind of call north central ish. Mm-hmm. And it was a very difficult area to live in, because we had high crime rates. Our RCMP detachment was 25 minutes to 30 minutes away from us. So if something happened in our community, we didn't get immediate response. We at one time had a hospital that closed down. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away. So it was very difficult to get to appointments. It was very difficult to even do something as simple as grocery shopping, and to be able to just do basic things that we take for granted. I lived under numerous water advisories. That was something that I wouldn't wish on anyone. And it's actually something that we're going to discuss in a webinar next week on Tuesday, because the effects of it is really devastating to children, to people. You don't normally hear these stories out in the media, but I struggled with rashes living through these water advisories, rashes that I have scars on my skin from, and it literally burnt my skin. And it was something that doctors couldn't figure out. I had to go to numerous specialists from the time I was about 9 or 10 till I left the reserve at 17. And they couldn't figure out what it was. So I was prescribed antibiotics almost that entire time. I was on different steroid creams. Like it's a big issue. Like you hear about these water advisories, but you don't think about the people behind them. And still to this day, we get water that is delivered by truck. We don't there. It's not piped. Our services aren't upgraded. We're dealing with very, very old infrastructure. And this is something that goes under the radar. Like we know there's water advisories in Canada, but it's something that that just slips under the radar. People don't hear the human side of the story, and that's one of the things that we struggle with. Another one is housing. You have 2 or 3 families living in one home, and you may not think this, we make things work as best as we can, and we may not see this as a huge issue, but during COVID, it was, because if one person got COVID, the entire family got COVID. And it just spread through my community like wildfire. And it was actually really sad because I couldn't visit my community because we physically blocked everything down. And my stepdad would be telling me every day there was an ambulance in my community, or Stars Air ambulance picking up someone. So it was a crazy time. So we need to address these issues. And I'm a huge advocate of it. And we need to do it today, not tomorrow, not 5 years from now. It needs to start today.
Thank you for sharing that. You said something really interesting that, we're not hearing these stories in the media. And sadly, I'm no longer in that world of the mainstream media. But again, what Curious Minds, the goal is to hear more of those stories. And I hope, that more people listening to these types of shows and podcasts can also start working to make change. And I know Jody Wilson-Raybould was here speaking in Windsor, and she made a comment, the fact that beyond wearing orange t-shirts or issues of flags, we need to look at how to really address the bigger problems. And we've had a brief talk about this too, I think, in terms of the changing of the words in the national anthem. And what's the other topic that come up? Like there seems to be a lot of media attention around topics like that, but not really digging into, and plus missing Indigenous women, right? I mean, that's the other, there are some topics I'm really at a loss why we're not hearing more about those, and those are being debated, and why they're not being debated.
I am so far beyond the performative actions. When I see people suffer in my community, changing one word on an anthem, that's not my priority. When we have high rates of suicide and we're having funerals almost every week. So changing one word on an anthem is not my priority. Raising a flag, lowering a flag, again, we got bigger things happening in my community that needs to be addressed. So that's all of this stuff is irrelevant to the people who are suffering on reserves today. One of the things that was announced was a monument, which I'm in support of. This is one thing that's going to be in place for a very long time, and it's going to remember residential school survivors like my grandmother. So it's something that I'm in support of. There's certain things that make sense, and then there's others that absolutely don't. And for the performative ones, those are the ones that seem to get more airtime. And I'm like, no, we should be talking about water. We should be talking about poverty on reserves. We should be talking about children in care and, allowing Indigenous communities to take care of their own. Like, these are discussions that need to be happening, not changing one word on an anthem. Like, I'm so beyond the performative stuff at this point in my life.
And you've written a comment too as well about, a column about Canada Day and fireworks. Do you want to maybe just kind of summarize? I don't have it in front of me, but there was one paragraph at the end that I thought just really hit home that, about the issue of, where priorities are. And right now there is some people that believe, okay, Indigenous people don't like Canada Day and want it stopped.
I've actually celebrated Canada Day every year since I was a child. When I was a child, it was just a staple in our summer. We went to the parade, we participated in the parade. My grandparents back in the 70s and 80s brought their horses into the parade. So it's something that's always been part of my life. I've never not looked at Canada Day as something that I didn't want to participate in, because it was always something that I did. And when you go into some of the events, highlighting some of the dancers, the singers, this is what Canada Day is about. It's about incorporating different cultures of people, and it's really bringing an awareness to Indigenous people in this country. So the whole cancellation of fireworks didn't make sense to me, because they were only canceling the fireworks part, but they still had celebrations going on that day. So what was the point of canceling one event? Like, that absolutely did not make sense to me. And another thing that really bothered me about that was they made the decision on behalf of the Indigenous community without saying who they consulted. And one of the things that I did was I emailed City Hall and I was like, who did you consult with this? Because chances are the neighboring communities are going to have their own fireworks. So for me, it didn't make sense. And I had a lot of questions about it. And I questioned their decision making. I even questioned the way they worded it. Like the city councilor that posted on Twitter, for me, I don't use that language. And in a professional sense, a lot of people don't use her language. So it really made me wonder where she got who she consulted. Was it just a couple of her friends who didn't like Canada Day? But yet you can speak for all of us, which is unfair, and which is something that I'm going to continually speak out about, because we should have different voices, different Indigenous voices, really saying what they want. And what most people want is to be part of it and to be involved with Canada Day or any celebration out there.
Definitely agree. And, I'm on a roundtable each week, and we talked about the fireworks issue. And I said, listen, me personally, I'm not a big fireworks fan, but I would never say don't have fireworks, because that's like my view. I personally sometimes think, and this is me saying this, I think it's a waste of money to hold up love, but there's people that love it and it's great for tourism. So there's all these other things. And I think that's what gets missed sometimes, is people sometimes, have a personal view, or they think they're speaking on behalf of a community. I live in a largely Muslim community too, where my neighborhood, and there's no offense about saying Merry Christmas, or they even put up lights, and so I've never yet met of anyone in my circle of Muslim friends that are ever concerned about the Merry Christmas comment, right? So I do want to welcome Inger. Inger has her show on Friday mornings, and also she does Wonder Woman Wednesday on Wednesdays. And she is a great person for really celebrating community and the power of connecting with others, and sharing stories as well. So, and she wrote something too, and I think this is also, she says, occasionally we're in our shows, don't cut it. We need to live the message. And I think it's not saying don't do it, but I think if it's the focus only, and I see this in, working in marketing, it's the annual, and I try to be careful of that myself, of posting something like a marketing message that, like, instead of just putting the message up on that day, like, am I doing something else other than the, image on social media saying I support something? Because it sometimes, I think people, it's the check mark. Okay, I posted it, but they're not doing anything else. And I do want to say one thing that I do want to say this for Inger, is that because of her shows, she's doing something to bring out different voices. So good point, Inger. And I think, so thank you for that, for your comment. The other thing, so there's so much we could talk about. In fact, I might want to have you back to talk about, Indigenous issues and what's happening, especially about, there's so many other topics. So my head is almost starting to explode of things I want to talk to you about. But because let's go back a little bit. We're going to go back a bit to the energy issue because I want to pull up a graphic and also want to talk about nuclear energy. And so let's first look at the image of what's happening in the world, because I'm a great advocate around curiosity to sometimes say, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Let's ask some questions and let's give context. And as a journalist, I always believe you have to put things in context, because it's very easy to just pull out something and, and I work in marketing. So believe me, I know how you can pull something out and make that your issue and forget about everything else. But, which I try to tell my clients, don't do that. You want to put things in context. Let's look at a graph that puts what's happening in Canada in context with the world. And what I will say is this is, I did get this, I think it was from, I'm not sure which website, but this also, I confirmed it. It's on a canada.ca website. So this comes from it's a Canadian government site. So this is not, I would say it's, not biased, or trying to be as not too biased about showing that it's from like an oil and gas website. Okay, so I'm going to share. Hold on just a minute. Share screen. Okay, and let's see if I get the right. Okay. Share. There we are. Okay. Hope everybody can see this. This shows, now there we're going back for everybody just tuning in. We've had an amazing discussion about Indigenous communities, but now we want to go back a little bit to the energy discussion, the oil and gas sector. So we have global emissions, and it was from 2019, but we talked about this. I don't think it's changed much, not proportionately. So global emissions 2019 and Canadian emissions. So let's look at the circle on the left. So we're doing the carbon tax. We're putting a lot of focus on mandates and moving to EV and telling, thou shalt make all these changes. And let's look at what percentage. Can you maybe explain this graph, probably Melissa, better even than I can? Because this is one of these like wow moments for me, like when I was studying the plastic industry as well, about what's happening.
So in terms of global emissions, like Canada is probably one of the lowest emitters out there and polluters out there. The numbers that I am interested in are the United States, our neighbor, who's at 12%. And then you have China, who is, almost at 30%. So when you look, and you had mentioned Google searches earlier, when you do a Google search of these two countries, they're the highest polluter as well as the highest emitter. And the United States is pretty good at sort of addressing some of the issues. But when you look at China, their solution is solar power, while they're still importing coal. So that doesn't make sense. Like if you're targeting emissions, you wouldn't be using coal-fired plants. You would use coal for steel making, but you wouldn't use it to generate power, so to speak. And Canada is on the lower end of it. There's some graphs that show us at 5%, which is still overall in terms of the world's biggest emitters. We're still on the lower end. Mm-hmm. And like you had mentioned, Canada is, we're taxing people. We're really pushing for EVs. We're not necessarily looking at our electrical grid in support of these EVs. So we have a long way to go. We can't just focus on one thing. We can't just focus on two things. We have to start having conversations about everything. And we need to really get every solution on the table. And we need to start bringing industry to these conversations, not just oil and gas, but we also have to start looking at manufacturers as well. Even potentially big buildings, 20, 30-story buildings. How are we going to, if we're going to go into low emissions, or we're trying to lower emissions, we need to start thinking about all this big infrastructure that we have, and we need to start coming up with solutions and not creating more problems down the road. What I see is that we're making decisions just for the sake of it. Like for EVs, yes, that's one solution, but what else can we look at in terms of transport where we can actually help, lower our emissions? And be even lower, I guess, in terms of pollution. So
Mhm.
Canada right now, as we stand today, we're one of the lowest emitters out there. But we're taxing we're taxing citizens like crazy. And that to me doesn't make sense at all. And we need to start looking at this through an adult lens. And we need to start looking at this not from an urgency sense where the world is going to end in 10 years. No, let's go past those conversations and let's start looking
Mhm.
at technology that can help us. Let's start talking about nuclear. That's not on the table. That should be talked about. And
Mhm.
we should be looking at it as an option. So there's a lot of conversations that we need to have that we're just not having right now. And that's frustrating, not only for me, but it's frustrating for our country because we're going down a road that's going to put us at risk. It's going to put our energy security at risk. And that's not going to be a topic of discussion until it actually happens, until we do have someone who says, nope, I'm not going to provide you with this. Like we have to start looking at some of the global affairs that are happening today, like the Ukraine Russia war and what's happening in terms of energy there. We have to start looking at this on a larger scale. And we're just not having these conversations, and that's frustrating.
Yes, definitely. Definitely frustrating is a good word. Now I'm just trying to let's go back and look at let's see if I can view tab file. Hold on. Let's see if I can trying to get that. Okay, there's the, now it's kind of small. I'm kind of, let me see if I can find, no, that's not what I want. Okay, so there's your, so the, hold on just a minute. I'm gonna just see if I can add to stream. I don't know how I get it back to, let's see, we'll do a little testing here now. Okay, so on this, and I'll share it again. I can share it in the comments, but 41% says other. Like what? That's like almost half is other. I always learn in accounting, like, avoid other. Like, is that's like almost half is who's
Is and is it natural causes? Like, is it volcanoes? Is it like, what is the other? What's inclusive in that? And I think that's something that needs to be explored because if it's 40%, that's almost half of the emissions. And if it's naturally occurring, then that needs to be a part of this conversation. Like, there's so much data that's being left out that we need to explore a little bit more. And the graph on the right is actually, it really piqued my attention, especially on the oil sand side. It has oil sands as 11%. One of the interesting things that are happening right now is there's this group or this company that's called Pathways Alliance. So what they're doing is they're working with the oil sands First Nations communities to reduce emissions, and they're implementing carbon capture. So more interesting tech that's being implemented. And if you can take some of that 11% away, if it goes from 11% to 9% in a period of 10 years, well, we've kind of figured out a way to reduce emissions. But companies out there, they're working on solutions, and I think more investment is needed to be able to bring that technology up to par. And even with the oil sands, like it took them 30 years to come onto production. It took them 30 years to work on the tech to be able to bring the commodity out of the ground. And they did it in various ways, such as SAGD, where they're working underground. There's some oil sands operations that are above ground, they're on the surface. And this is another thing that we can look at as well. We can look at the abandonment and reclamation side. What is that going to look like after these projects are done? What is the plan in place? And I think for Canadians, they need to see more of that. And that was an area that I worked in back in my early career. And it was a really rewarding career. It's something that you can bring Indigenous people onto because it involves the environment. You're out there taking soil samples, water samples every year. You're out there looking at the vegetation, seeing if it's growing the way it should, planting trees. These are all things that Canadians can get on board with. And I think that part of the industry is less spoken about. And I think they really need to kind of revamp that and show the work that they do, because some of the work that I've seen, some of the projects were 20 plus years, and I was just seeing the completion end of it. And that was very interesting to see. Like, they planted whole forests out there, and to see what it looked like from start to finish after reclamation, that was pretty impressive. And this is work that's happening today that people don't necessarily hear about. So it's another voice to the conversation that's not necessarily heard or even talked about.
I'm gonna do a Joe Rogan. I would love to see a debate between yourself and, let's see, who is the federal minister for environmental issues. I would,
That's Stephen Gibo.
yeah. I mean, that would be really interesting to bring someone like, I wish your voice, was heard at, in House of Commons, instead of all these kind of, at times, what I consider pretty, at times, ridiculous debates. It seems that if we could hear more, and let's look at the data. Let's look, see, I would love to put this chart up on the wall and look at the global emissions and say, okay, let's have a discussion about what this means. Because, okay, am I off base on this? Like, if I was in charge of things, wouldn't you want to put this up and say, we're 1.5%. There's 41%. And so 3/4 of the world right now is churning out these emissions. So shouldn't we be trying to find a way to fix that, rather than the carbon tax and like hurting our own people in this country when we're at 1.5, or let's say we're at 5%, whatever, like, let's not debate whether we're off by a few percentage points. Is that realistic? Like, am I just Pollyanna on this, or like?
I think Canadians need to see the whole picture, because they're not. They're only seeing one side of this equation, which is taxing people, really promoting EVs, manufacturing, electrical vehicles. They're really promoting one side of this equation. And really what we should be doing right now is getting everybody into this conversation, like manufacturers, airlines, oil and gas industry, everyone that produces some type of emission should be part of this conversation. The next step would be looking at the technology that's needed, because I'm really on the side of technology and helping us get to net zero. And we should start talking about investing in these initiatives, because that's a conversation that's not happening. That should 100% be happening right now. And companies, they should be, we should be looking at them as partners, not enemies. And that's exactly what we're doing right now, is that we're looking at these industries like they're our enemies. And this is a Canadian industry. This is an industry that we can be proud of. This is an industry that promotes and provides a lot of jobs. It's an industry that could be improved, yes. But they're not the enemy here. We need to work with them. And that's what I want to see more of. I want to see more collaboration. I want to see Indigenous voices in those conversations, because our worldview has always been to protect the environment. Our worldview isn't to necessarily stop an industry. That's just a byproduct of this conversation. So if we look at ways to really enhance the environment, protect the environment, maybe not necessarily get more regulations out there, but let's get technology that's going to help this. In terms of pipelines, like, that's been a huge debate the last 5 or so years. If you're not in support of pipelines, what's the solution? How can we safely transport commodities across this country? If it's not pipelines, then what? What's the alternative? And these are questions that people aren't answering. They're just like, no pipelines. Okay, well, maybe let's work with the pipeline companies and figure out how they can maybe monitor them a little bit more, how they can shut them off quicker, how they can identify a leak faster. These are things that we should be asking for, not halting an entire industry because we don't like it. So we need to, like I've said, we need to start having very adult conversations about energy, about transportation, about reducing emissions. We need to bring more people to this table to be able to come up with better solutions.
Wow, thank you, Melissa. That is really well put, and I do want to say we're definitely going to have more discussions on this because I'm really fascinated by this, and it's a bit like I got very much into. I work in mold making, so plastics is a big discussion, and I had on a previous guest, much like you, that has data, has research, and has a reasonable approach to things. And Christy Arment, I did interview with him looking at plastics. And it reminded me of this graph I just put up about emissions, because I often ask people, what percentage of waste do you think plastics make up? And I know it's based on weight and you can have that debate, but plastics are 1% of overall waste. And yet we have this like belief, and it's more of an emotional belief, that plastics are killing us. And um, anyways, that's another, for anybody listening and is curious about that topic. I do have another interview on that. And I think we're now winding up to the hour, and I do want to have another talk probably about nuclear energy, but I will say this for anybody interested. Oliver Stone was a guest on Joe Rogan. And again, I listened to the entire interview. I was fascinated again by, they use stats and data, not just, and talked about that versus emotion. And that's kind of reminding me about our talk today. So we sometimes need to go look at the data. And I posted a quote today too that said, knowledge is the antidote to fear, and by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So I hope you will come back another time. And I must say, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is very, wow, they are, I hope they know what a rock star you are, because you are not only knowledgeable, but very well versed in explaining this. So thank you for helping me understand it better as well.
Oh, you're welcome. And I wish we could have got a little bit more into nuclear, because that is a very interesting topic. And I think that's actually a topic on its own.
Yes, I think what I'm going to do is, I might have going to try to go watch that documentary. Maybe we'll circle back and have a discussion about that. And if there's anybody else that, anybody listening, I would love to have a discussion focused on that, because that is mind blowing what I learned about that. And just before we wrap up, how do you exercise your curious mind? And I know you have a curious one. So how do you, I see you have a cat and a dog. What other things do you do to,
I'm really big into podcasts. So I travel a lot, and I'll download like quite a bit of like episodes, like a lot of audio. And I also I really like YouTube videos like this, like where you're just listening to everyday people about certain topics, because they'll say something that will just throw you off on certain things. And it's like, I never thought of that. Like, and, getting into the conversation of carbon capture, concrete. I've never thought they would add carbon to concrete and use it for different purposes. Like, that just blew my mind a few months ago. And it's information, little information like that, that really helps drive what I'm doing and what I'm advocating for, because it's not so much a one-sided conversation. You're actually bringing in different industries, different manufacturing type conversations. And it gets me, especially me, it gets me outside of my oil and gas box, and it gets me thinking about other industries out there, other industries across this country. And I'm like, well, if something can help oil and gas on this end, it can actually be transferred over to something else, and that's a win for everyone. So I really enjoy conversations like this. I enjoy, different perspectives. And I'm definitely going to check out the inspiration from Ingor after this, because, I really like being introduced to other individuals as well. And I think we
yes.
can learn a lot from each other.
We can indeed. We can do more, together. And I must say, I am just learning so much now about this topic, and I now feel a little more comfortable discussing it, because it's. But what I've noticed, I always look for patterns, and one of the patterns I see is that anytime you have views that are shut down, or people don't want to hear another view they don't agree with, that's when my journalism brain goes, I want to know more about this. I want to better understand why someone has that view, and whether it's like even people who say they don't believe in climate change. And I think what happens is with some of these things is that people take these views because they don't trust or believe in the system. And we talked a bit about this too, about, science, and as if there's, only one science on certain things. And I don't know where that it really came up during the pandemic too. Like there's only one science. And uh, I just found that really strange. And I'm seeing it on a lot of other, what I call hot button topics, that it's sort of, if you don't agree with and fall in line, you're going to be censored. And the level of people being censored right now, I am in shock. People that, and again, the said person that's running for a presidential election in the States was a once revered environmental lawyer. And he's very much wanting to, work to save the environment too. And it's interesting how, he was once at one point celebrated and now kind of completely censored. But that's why we have podcasts on Spotify. That's why we have other things like Substack and Twitter. And yeah, we can go there and have these discussions. And maybe at some point I'll do just a show just on Twitter, because then maybe I'll do that, because then you can say what you want there.
True.
Yeah.
Have you done any spaces or any?
You know what? I haven't for a while, but I would love to. Maybe that's something we could talk about. I'd love to do one with you even sometime and have some of these topics. That would be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I'm interested in like spaces, but I never have time for them. Like I
Yeah.
never have time to attend them or be part of them. Like it's always a timing issue. So
Yeah.
hopefully we can connect on
Yeah.
a Twitter space sometime soon.
Yeah. I'm the same. There's so many, live shows, and it's hard. That's why I said the good thing about this show, while we're doing it live, it's also going to be on replay on YouTube, and people can come back. And because I know someone like Jim Vinosky will want to listen to this when he's back. We've talked, and I think you and him would have some similar views when it comes to manufacturing. He very much is in the perspective that getting away from this all or nothing, like we have to come up with solutions. And what's interesting, that's why curiosity, as I said at the start, I mean, it's all about innovation. I mean, we can't be innovative if we don't hear these wide range of views, and as opposed to views only that are seen as acceptable, and I guess that's, I have always, maybe that's why too, for me, journalism was so important, was that I always wanted to go hear people's stories. And even when I was covering anything political, I always try to remove whatever. I mean, I could never completely remove a bias. Obviously, I have beliefs, I have opinions on things, but I was always trying to think about, well, it's their story. It's not my story to judge. So I'm going to try to tell their story in the best way possible, even if I don't agree.
Yeah. And that's how journalism should be today. Like get a couple of viewpoints in your story. Don't make it so biased that, you're only seeing or hearing one voice. And that's, as an Indigenous person, that's something that I pretty much struggle with every day, because, it seems like one voice kind of overshadows the other, when we should all be heard at some point, and our viewpoint should be out there to give a balanced view on things. And that's the only fair way to go. And I think one of the things is breaking up that monolith that we're all one voice, because we're not.
Yes. And hence back to, there's a show I watched, Ted Lasso, and there was a great scene in there, the dart scene, and it's be curious, not judgmental. Because if you are really a curious person, it's a lot harder to be judgmental, because you're going to go listen to all views and come away with hopefully a bigger perspective of what's happening. So, okay, I'm going to have you go to the green room. I'll be back. I'll be there in just a few seconds. I'm just going to wrap up, and then I'll meet you in there. Okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks
and
for
thank you
having me.
taking time, because I know you have a very busy travel schedule, work schedule. So I really appreciate you here today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining in. We went a little past the hour, but I thought it was really important to also make sure that we, I would encourage you to go follow Melissa. She is on LinkedIn, but is a lot more active on Twitter. So I encourage you to go, follow her there. She has some really great perspectives. And I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. And I know I have really learned a lot. I will post that chart as well that shows, the global emissions, because we really need to look at what's happening that 70% of the world and the impact of a lot of the taxes and things, and how that impacts the most economically disadvantaged in our society. And that's something I'm always been an advocate for, is that, how can we try to balance things out in our world. Thanks everyone for joining Curious Minds with GailNow. And remember, it's always important to sign up, suit up, and show up. And if anyone does want to reach out to me and talk about how they can better tell and share their story, you can reach me through any of my various social media platforms. And I'm at gail@gailnow.com. And if you Google GailNow, you'll find me. Okay, thanks everyone. Take care and see you at the next show.